Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by the legendary labor organizer, Jono Shaffer. When Jono Shaffer retired from the Service Employees International Union in 2021, Harold Meyerson of the American Prospect said, "Over the past 4 decades, there have been scores of gifted and dedicated union organizers who've done great work, only to see that work thwarted by labor law that now enables management to defeat nearly all efforts at unionization, as Amazon recently did at its Alabama warehouse. So it's particularly notable when one of those organizers actually leads efforts that end in historic victories, and more notable still when those victories lead to the unionization of entire sectors of workers. One of those precious few organizers, Jono Shaffer, the Los Angeles-based organizing genius of the Service Employees International Union. He has organized janitors, childcare workers, security guards. Jono Shaffer, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
It's my pleasure, Nathan. Thanks for having me. I take issue with the term genius.
Do you? Organizing genius? You don't think that applies?
Those kinds of platitudes I definitely shy away from. And all good organizing is a team effort. So have I contributed to a lot of incredibly good and successful campaigns? I would own that.
Yeah, I think it is fair to say, we can dispute Harold Myerson's particular characterization and whether it perhaps gives undue emphasis to the individual over the collective effort. But I think it is fair to say that you are known for having innovated strategies that have worked on different campaigns, which is what we want to talk about today. I'd like our conversation to be about, for people who are unfamiliar with the campaigns you've worked on, to tell us a little bit about that history and the lessons that you have learned and what could be applicable in organizing today. Andrew Gomez, in an article about your work, takes us back to the beginning and says that when you were hired in 1987 for the Justice For Janitors Campaign, it was a difficult moment. Union density in janitorial services in Los Angeles hovered around 10%. Years of a union decline, coupled with the disparate nature of the city, presented unique challenges to organizing. And so I wonder if you could start by taking us back to that moment and telling us a little bit about where labor was. Take us to the bottom of the mountain, looking up at the task ahead.
So, I began my union organizing work in Los Angeles. I was actually raised in Northern California, but moved to LA to start organizing initially garment workers. And LA was notoriously anti-union as compared to the Bay Area or New York. People thought of LA as a impenetrable location in terms of organizing unions. And the nation was going through numerically its largest influx of new immigrants in its history in the 80s. And almost exclusively, those folks were coming through the southern border and landing in LA and other places around LA. And so there was just this belief in the labor movement that with all of these new immigrants who were undocumented, who were desperate and easily exploited, that there was just no chance. At the same time, the historical foundation of labor's membership in the U.S., which was manufacturing, was being decimated. Auto plants were closing, steel plants were closing, the garment industry, which was my first industry that I started working in, was basically completely gone. There was a chunk left in LA, and that was soon to be gone too. All of it going overseas. Even in the service sector, call centers were going overseas. The manufacturing of all of the materials needed for high tech was being done overseas. And so there was just this decimation in the private sector of union membership. And had it not been for the change in laws in the early 70s and late 60s, where public sector workers could unionize, then membership would have been almost nil. And I want to point out that one of the seminal battles in public sector work was a racial justice battle in Memphis, Tennessee, with the sanitation workers. And they did not have the right to organize. They did not have the right to strike. And yet in 1968, they did. And in some ways, that lesson is a perfect one for what we encountered when I started, and I think what the labor movement needs to confront now.
You mean it doesn't matter whether you have the right technically? What in particular are you singling out about the Memphis?
The law is not the determining factor in worker power.
Mm.
And in fact, by definition, law is defined to protect the status quo. And so, given that the status quo in this country is fundamentally non union, then if we build strategies that utilize the legal structures that are in existence, we're going to lose. That's just the logical conclusion of the way law works. And so, whether it was the Memphis sanitation workers' historic strike, which was a group of workers that legally were supposedly unable to strike, the farm workers' struggles in the 60s and 70s, where the farm workers were explicitly excluded from organizing rights as covered by the National Labor Relations Act, and there were no laws governing organizing for farm workers. The issue of undocumented workers, particularly in places like Los Angeles, where there are literally millions of them, who are technically excluded from legal protections because they're undocumented. So all of those things, if you were to use the laws that have been established, would lead one to not even attempt to begin organizing. And yet, in many ways, the greatest breakthroughs, arguably all the major breakthroughs in the history of the labor movement, have occurred outside of legal structures designed to address labor relations.
So let's return to the late 1980s. When you get into this, it's a bleak moment. As you have indicated, Ronald Reagan is the president of the United States. He's fired 10,000 air traffic controllers successfully. Not many national successful labor campaigns. So you start working with a population of people who are considered particularly difficult to organize. They're part-time, they're undocumented. How do you begin with the Justice for Janitors Campaign? I mean, you don't believe at that point in time that the situation is hopeless. You do believe that it's worth trying things. So where did you start at a moment like that?
We started meeting workers and understanding the situation that workers were facing in their workplaces and in their communities. And because literally, I would say 99% of the workers that were cleaning office buildings in Los Angeles, where I worked, were immigrant workers, and the vast majority of those were undocumented immigrant workers. It was about understanding who they were, where they came from, finding indigenous leadership within those communities, within those workforces, who could establish the kind of basis necessary to succeed. And I would say it starts there with the workers. And on the other hand, it starts with a deep understanding of the capital structures that created the conditions that workers were facing. And in some ways, both of those elements were new at that time.
Okay.
They weren't new if you look back at the 30s when the CIO busted away from the AFL and said, hey, capital is not what it used to be. But they were new for what the labor movement was doing at the time. And so we did those two things really deeply, which was engage with the workforce sort of very intentionally. Our team, as we built it, was made up of folks who were of that community. I was one of two white organizers out of a team of 10. Everybody else was Latino, many of whom were functionally monolingual Spanish speaking, which would have been completely unheard of in the local that I worked at, let alone the rest of the labor movement, where the idea of hiring somebody who didn't speak English was kind of out of the question. But we had no problem with that, building a team that was capable of connecting to workers, and then simultaneously developing a very deep understanding of how the commercial real estate and cleaning industries work and function.
Yeah.
Interestingly, both of those areas were in dramatic transition. The way that commercial real estate was owned and managed and operated was going through a radical transformation in the late 80s and into the 90s. And the workforce in the 80s had gone through a radical transformation with the influx of Latino immigrant workers.
Yeah, I'd love it if you could tell us more about what you're saying, that it was important to understand the capital structure. Could you tell us more about what you mean by this kind of analysis and how and why it was helpful?
Back in the day, buildings more or less individually or a handful were owned by somebody, and they employed the people that serviced those buildings directly. And they owned them, they had some investors, but it was very much a localized situation. But in the 80s and dramatically in the 90s and into the 21st century, the ownership structure of real estate was completely turned on its head. And how buildings were owned moved to large real estate investment companies who built massive pools of investment capital, institutional investors that they could utilize to buy buildings, operate on scale. And then they created legal structures, the first one being dramatically the thing called a real estate investment trust, which is basically a mutual fund of real estate. Those were publicly traded entities. So people were part owners of buildings by buying a share of a real estate investment trust. And then those trusts were able to manipulate tax laws and other things to avoid their responsibilities to communities and amass mountains of capital with which to buy properties. And that was a whole different ballgame from the perspective of organizing. Historically, the labor law is created and still to this day exists to put the legal entity that a worker has the lawful right to organize against is whoever their direct employer is, whoever signs their paycheck. And that was a legitimate structure when employers employed people, or when the people that controlled employment employed the people themselves. But in this, what I call vertically disintegrated capital structure of real estate investment using large multinational property management firms and equally large multinational service contractors, the people that controlled the realities that workers were forced to endure were these big finance entities and property owners, but they were not the legal employers of the workers. And so, under the National Labor Relations Act, to this day, it's unlawful to engage in secondary boycotts of people who aren't the direct employer of the workers. Well, that might have been okay when employers employed the workers. It's certainly irrelevant to the reality of today when the people that control the lives of workers are completely removed.
So if you organize it in accordance with the structure assumed by the law, and you're just going after this cleaning company contractor, the building managers could just, you succeed against the cleaning company, they just get a new cleaning company.
They fired them overnight. Literally, the union, which had successfully organized janitors in the previous structure when they were more controlled by the buildings themselves, they lost 75% of the industry in LA, went non-union in a period of about 16, 18 months. There was not a single decertification election. Workers didn't vote at all on whether or not to be union during that whole period. Building owners just started firing contractors, and they could do it on a day's notice. I met many, many workers who told me about how they showed up at a building and the buckets, the big barrels that they used on the floors were on the sidewalk the day they showed up to work because the building owners had the legal right contractually to fire contractors. Had no, they would argue, and they weren't busting unions; they were making business decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the lesson, that one of the main lessons that the labor movement and people who are organizing now need to move forward from, which is understanding the market realities that the industry that workers are working in operate from, and building a movement of workers that aren't linked to any particular location, but rather to the industry itself. Our campaign was Justice for Janitors. It wasn't justice for the janitors that clean, 1278 Wilshire Boulevard, right?
Mm.
And the traditional union organizing approach to this day is to organize a group of workers in a given place. I mean, even to look at the Starbucks elections, which they're doing some phenomenal work and organizing at a pace unparalleled in recent history. All of those elections are still store by store. And so what we did was we said, we're building a committee of workers, a movement of workers that is within the entire geography that we're organizing. It was the Los Angeles Justice for Janitors Campaign. It wasn't the downtown campaign or the Wilshire Boulevard campaign. It was all janitors cleaning office buildings. It was about building an identity of that campaign that was beyond their lives as workers, but understanding their lives within the cultures and communities that they belong to. So that when we were battling with the real estate industry, we were battling with them for what they were doing to the Latino community of Los Angeles, not for what they were doing to a group of janitors in a given building. So that's a sort of two major pieces. The third piece was to really get inside how the owners of the buildings did their business. Who were they getting their money from? What kind of relationship could we find to that money? What was the process by which they had to go through to build whatever they were building? More often than not, when these guys are building big buildings to this day, they are getting massive subsidies, public subsidies on taxes and things like that to develop those projects on the premise that they're benefiting the community. And yet, if they're impoverishing workers, then how are they benefiting the community? They're getting a tax break and ripping off workers and impoverishing communities. And so I think understanding all of those dynamics and putting them into play. And we did not do any NRDLA. We legally could have tried to. We could have run elections on a building by building basis or on a contractor by contractor basis. But as you pointed out earlier, when those elections were won prior to my tenure in organizing by my predecessors, the building owners just canceled the contracts. And so we'd go through a year-long process to have an election when the company would get fired.
I think people will understand what you're saying about how it didn't make sense to do it on a workplace by workplace basis. And when people hear that you had the regional movement that is more than just trying to get a particular employer to go union, that makes sense. However, then the question is, I think it is easier to see a path. It is easier to see the steps when you're talking about unionizing a particular employer. There's a kind of model for this. What is the path for this kind of movement model that actually gets you towards a unionized janitors? How do you get there?
One of the most important elements of this, and I was thinking about this after we spoke earlier, a foundational principle is that the government nor the bosses should be able to determine if a union exists or not.
Hmm.
The only people that can and should determine if there's a union are the workers who make up that union. And you don't need sanction from the government or sanction from the boss to be a union. And so what we did was implement being union as soon as we had enough power to wield.
Hmm.
So if a group of workers in a building that was non-union, they weren't organizing to get a union, right? That like if you ask, what do you want? It's not like, oh, I'm dreaming of a union. It's like I'm dreaming of making more money. I'm dreaming of having health insurance. I'm dreaming of not sticking bare hands into buckets of chemicals that I don't know what they are, right? I'm dreaming of not vacuuming 50,000 square feet a night. And all of those things I just mentioned are things that workers can and should and do fight for with or without a union contract in place. And so that's really what we implemented, not so intentionally, frankly. My friends and I, who were part of that early group, we always joke with each other. If we had known what we weren't allowed to do, we would have gotten our asses kicked. But we didn't. We were all newbies. We were from the outside. Like I had been a student activist and a community activist. So I didn't know what labor law was. I didn't know what a secondary boycott was. So we just engaged workers and identified the issues that they needed to win and started fighting for them. We demanded them of building owners. We demanded them of cleaning contractors. One of my favorite and one of the most powerful leaflets we ever put out, we took the photo of a worker's hand that was completely broken out in blisters from having been sticking his hand in and out of buckets of chemicals without gloves to clean. I made this flyer, but we took a photograph. This is before digital, before the internet. We took a photograph. We got it developed. We stuck it on a piece of paper and we said, shake the hand of the worker that cleans your building every night. And it was just this heavily blistered hand. And we passed it out in front of the buildings so that the people going in and out of the building had to confront the fact that these workers weren't being given the supplies they needed to work safely. And not surprisingly, we started seeing people getting gloves. A traditional union organizing approach to something like that would have been to fight to win a union election and then win that election and then sit down at the bargaining table to try to win gloves.
Right.
So 2.5 years after the worker decided they needed gloves, they're maybe bargaining to win a pair of gloves. We're the next day out in front of the building saying this guy needs gloves. So we call that being a union or acting union from day one. And so that's how you do it. And it takes a long time.
Yeah.
The unions themselves, the institutions, have to be willing to forego short-term wins and short-term traditional measurable outcomes like union elections.
Okay. Yeah.
But we still had to have measurable victories. We just had to measure them in different forms. Like winning a 30-person election for one office building, that would have been something we could go to the leadership of the union and say, see, we're winning.
That's the kind of short-term victory you're talking about, yeah.
We call those numbers on the wall, right? Can you put numbers on the wall? But the fact of the matter is that those 30 workers would then have been taken in large part out of the fight because they would have been stuck trying to bargain a contract in a building against some big, huge multinational corporation versus saying we're a union, declaring that we were a union, and fighting for the improvements that workers in the community needed from Jump Street.
Right. So help me understand how power works in that situation again, because we can kind of understand very easily how it works in the traditional model. You talked about an example there with the photo and the gloves, which I think people can conceive that a building owner doesn't want to be embarrassed by everyone who goes into this building knowing that they horribly mistreat their janitors. So that's a kind of example of how the power works. It seems like in that case the power comes from public shaming.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about how, without a recognized union, you can actually exact concessions.
So there's a thing called a corporate web. All these things have names now that we didn't have when we were starting, but we would have to identify and understand all of the angles that could apply pressure on the people that had power, in this case, the building owners. They're susceptible to regulatory power. They're susceptible to political power. They're susceptible to financial power, investment power, legal power. They're susceptible to public relations because they need to maintain a certain public image in order to be able to be successful. And so we had to build our campaigns in a way that was able to attack all of them. So in that situation, we're using the public relations aspect. But in addition, we're filing Cal OSHA, occupational safety and health complaints about unsafe working conditions. We were identifying who the institutional investors of that building were. And while we couldn't go and do a boycott or picket the building owner, which is how the National Labor Relations Board defines secondary boycotts, you can't picket that building owner, but you could go talk to his investors with the janitor in his hands and say, this is what's going on in your investment. Do you think this is a good investment? If this kind of stuff is going on in your building. In using that example again, we put out the leaflet. It's not just, do you want that person's hand getting destroyed while cleaning the building? If the chemicals that worker is using to clean the building are doing that to his hand, what are they doing to you every day when you go into the kitchen to make a cup of coffee? Or while you're sitting at the desk, putting your hands on the desk that was cleaned with those chemicals. So it's about really taking this to that fullest and most creative possible option. One of the things we did with the gloves campaign was we use a lot of props in our organizing. So I dressed up as Santa Claus on Christmas, a nice Jewish atheist boy dressed up as Santa Claus. And we went into an office building, which lots of Santas used to do before 9/11. Now it's very difficult. And went straight up to the office of the building owner, me as Santa and some janitor elves. And we walked in, and I remember the secretary looking at it, and she was like so excited. Oh, Santa, what have you got for me? And I'm like, oh. And I reach into my bag and I pull out just a package of Playtex living gloves, like this simple yellow ones you see in the store with a Justice For Janitors sticker on it. And I said, we're bringing gloves because you guys won't provide them to the workers. She flipped out. She called security. We had a TV crew, an LA Times reporter, and a cameraman with us. And it showed up in the LA Times the next day. But it's about being creative and understanding how to utilize the opportunities that are there on a daily basis. And one of the things I've always felt going forward in my career is I was unknowingly lucky to have cut my teeth in a subcontracted environment. Most unions wouldn't touch subcontracted workers with a 10-foot pole because of the problem that if you organize the subcontractor, the client would fire them. But by cutting our teeth in a subcontracted world, we actually were preparing ourselves to understand how capital was structured across all sectors. Even a company like, Amazon. Yeah, the management of the company and the administration of the company and the board of directors of the company, they're calling the shots on a day-to-day basis, but they're answering to a set of financial investors who really are wielding the power. And that's just simply applying the subcontracted analysis model to every situation you go into, which is who's got the power.
Mm.
And as the song goes, you got to fight the power if you want to win. And I think taking the time to understand where that power is essential to win.
Your Santa Claus story sort of reminds me that you're known for a willingness to be disruptive. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about the role of disruption, the willingness to get in the way of what those who have the power to decide would like their day to look like.
Yeah, fundamentally, disruption is the most important element of any successful organization. The people you're up against, their success is predicated on calm and predictability.
Mm-hmm.
And so our job is to do the opposite, be disruptive in any and every way possible. Strikes are a very clear mechanism or tool of disruption, but they were more powerful in years gone by when production was stoppable in the 30s, and when the workers sat down in the Flint GM plant and refused to leave, there were no cars that could get made. So that was disruption. Now it's much more difficult to cause that kind of production disruption through strikes. And the laws that are in existence undermine the ability to run a successful strike. Employers are able to run the strike breakers into struck situations. In our situation, it took so few janitors to clean a building. There was no way we were going to make them dirty.
Right.
Like literally 100,000 square foot office building would be cleaned by 5 people. That would be the typical staffing. And so if we were, and there's entrances from all sides. So you're not like going to close an office building and make sure it's dirty. So really, striking was about creating the ability to bring people together to be disruptive, whether that was doing actions and activities at the office buildings themselves. As that became harder and harder because of legal issues that occurred, people were, building owners would get injunctions against us being too disruptive on their property because oftentimes they owned the whole block. Well, that meant that we had to be in the street because the sort of business as usual requires that everything be running the way it's supposed to. So then we ended up, marching in the street, crossing sidewalks, crossing streets, creating chaos with traffic. In Washington, D.C., campaign I wasn't working on, they are famous for having blocked the 14th Street Bridge into Washington one morning with a big, huge school bus driven sideways across the street. And, some people were like, well, what the hell does that have to do with the buildings? I was like, well, if people can't get to the buildings, then it's not business as usual.
Mm.
And the political class is catering to the financial class on a regular basis. And so we had to make life miserable for both of those classes. If we were expecting to bring enough pressure to bear. And so we did a lot of street protests, a lot of street theater, a lot of creativity stuff that we learned from the farm workers movement. Farm workers had wonderful street theater, music, cultural activities, big, huge marches. So they did the boycotts at the stores. They were legally able to do those boycotts at the stores, by the way, of the grapes, because they weren't covered by the law. Elite secondary boycotts in the farm industry were not illegal because there was no law, right? Had another union tried to do that was covered by the National Labor Relations Act, they would have been enjoined and shut down in 24 hours. So it's just another example.
So obviously it takes years, but how ultimately did the Justice for Janitors Campaign in Los Angeles get building owners to capitulate and give in and recognize that they're going to have union janitors.
We had a couple of tipping point victories that sort of got us to a level of market representation that enabled us to begin to really bargain. One was utilizing the development process in Los Angeles through the notoriety and public response to the janitor organizing campaigns. If people wanted to build a new building in LA, they had to go through a political permitting process. They were always asking for subsidies. They were asking for other kinds of things. So we worked really hard to make sure that they would not be able to build a new building if they weren't willing to commit to fair wages and benefits for the people that clean those buildings, which had not been the case for decades and decades before. It was often the case for construction workers. They would get these prevailing wage rules and other kinds of stuff, the Davis-Bacon Act and things like that. But it wasn't true for service workers, so we did that. We created massive disruption and had a number of building owners make the decision that they just didn't want to have it. It wasn't worth it. The cost of fighting against what we were doing was way more than it would cost to do the right thing for the handful of people that cleaned their buildings. We, in Los Angeles, we had sort of the seminal battle in Century City, which is an area where there's a tremendous amount of entertainment business. It's not where the studios are necessarily, but it's where some of the corporate types of the studios are and where a lot of their lawyers are. And it's very compact. It's in a 6 or 7 square block area. And so we began organizing there and were able to create massive disruption. And it turned out that there was one major building owner, a guy from Chicago, who ended up becoming the focal point a lot of this fight, which is he was undermining the quality of life in Los Angeles. And so we printed up garbage bags, or actually they were grocery bags, and we distributed them all over the country and said that people should mail their trash to the company in Chicago. For some reason, right at this moment, I'm blanking on this guy's name. I can see his face. And he was getting trash from all over the world. That's after a while. Like Canada, people got these bags. They were packaging up their bags and mailing in trash. Not a secondary boycott. We were actually providing him things, not taking things away. And so he came under that kind of scrutiny that also impacted his ability to go and raise money for his future projects because people knew about it. It's like, what's going on? JMB Properties is what it was called. That was the name of the company. And so eventually things got so hot there. There was a very famous police riot when we were on strike in Century City in 1990. And LAPD, which is notorious for its soft touch in handling people, waded into our strike and beat the hell out of a bunch of people, janitors and community people, and that created a political crisis in which the then mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, first black mayor in the history of LA, stepped in and said, "This is I'm stopping this. This is not happening in my city." And he got a hold of the folks in Chicago, and he said, "Get this finished." So between that fight and the making sure that all buildings were opening with companies that used responsible contractors and building this based movement of the Latino community, enough pressure was built that we were able to break through. And from start to finish, on my first day going out and talking to a janitor in 1987, we settled our first countywide, LA countywide contract in 1995, so 8 years. There were a couple of incremental wins along the way that kept us having the resources we needed to do our work. But, arguably the first really substantial economic wins for everybody in the county didn't happen until 2000, when there was another huge strike. a countywide strike. First time we struck countywide. And so, that's what I say. It's like people have to be committed to investing the time it's going to take. And, you'll get the yeses on the front end. Oh, yeah, we're down for whatever it takes.
Mm.
But then a year in, they're wanting to see, what do you have to show for it? And if you're fighting a company the size of Walmart or Amazon or Starbucks, you're not going to win the way you used to be able to when you could sit in and shut down a factory like they did.
So, what you've been telling us here is consistent with what you wrote in an article you co-authored with Stephen Lerner, where you said that the key lesson is that there is no silver bullet. There isn't one thing, one strategy, one action, or one tactic that magically beats billionaires or creates the space for a movement to develop. You've been talking about a diversity of approaches, creativity, thinking about how power is actually structured, how you can exert pressure through disruption. I want to just read another quick quote from that piece where you say that Justice for Janitors unquestionably provides critical lessons for future organizing as Wall Street and the finance industry increasingly take control over the global economy. We have to look up the economic food chain, target the real culprits. We have to bring as many stakeholders to the fight as possible and creatively and aggressively organize to disrupt business as usual for those in control. That can mean strikes, civil disobedience, engaging shareholders, which you talked about, or directly challenging other business, social, and political interests and their exploitative practices and schemes. And you've talked a bit so far about how that worked in Justice for Janitors. I want to turn, you just mentioned Amazon, Walmart, Starbucks. And so in conclusion, I want to ask you, Amazon has pretty infamously now, they had to, obviously the employees at JFK, Staten Island, won their NLRB election, but now Amazon, of course, won't negotiate with them. So they have same is true with Starbucks. These employees who have organized very courageously, very successfully to win elections, then haven't successfully gotten contracts, and Starbucks has strung them along. If you were sitting down with organizers from Amazon, from Starbucks, who say, look, we've done all this great work, we're really proud of it, we've beaten them in some ways, but now we're kind of stuck because they won't negotiate with us. What would you say in terms of how they need to be thinking about what they can do in order to actually beat these behemoths?
It's very difficult, and I don't want to come across as sort of, I've got all the answers, or we have all the answers about what they could do. But the most important things are those two elements that we talked about at the beginning, which is what are the mechanisms for disruption that we can develop and utilize? And then what are the financial pressures and structures in place so that you can target your activity in the right location? And doing that analysis, one of the things I would think about would be, so I've come to believe very, very strongly that NLRB elections are a waste of time and in many ways counterproductive. The election part of the National Labor Relations Board is a system that is built to benefit employers for the most part. And as we've seen in the janitor campaigns, probably been part of campaigns that have helped, maybe even as many as 500,000 workers organize over the years in sum total overall. And none of them were traditional NLRB candidates. I think I've been involved in 3 NLRB elections in my life. One, lost one, and then one, they never counted the ballots. And the thing is that workers need to be taking action from day as early as possible, engaging in the battles over what they're trying to win and being disruptive. What the NLRB can and does do better is with regard to workers, protecting workers' rights. You can file unfair labor practice charges. And as we've seen with the Starbucks campaign, create a tremendous amount of pressure on the company. Starbucks has put a lot of workers back to work that they fired and that they didn't want to put back to work. That wasn't because they won the elections. That wasn't because they bargained with the company to get them to put them back. That was because they used a tool and pressure that forced the company to act. And so I think developing your strategies in the ways that are really angling, understanding what the people with the power are trying to accomplish and finding ways to intervene in that. One thing I say when I'm helping people figure out strategies is where these companies are is not where they're vulnerable. Where they're vulnerable is where they want to go. What are they trying to move to? Because that's where they are not stable. That's where they're trying to figure stuff out. That's where they're looking for help. A building owner is not vulnerable in the building he's already built and is fully occupied. A building owner is vulnerable in the building he wants to build and needs to get occupied in order to make money. I want to know, what are Amazon's next ventures? Maybe we have to fly to the moon and meet Bezos there or something like that. What are Starbucks' next ventures? Where are they trying to grow their business? Because all of those places are the places where there's significant vulnerability. And that would be a piece that I would really try to understand and develop campaigns with.
Well, we've hit a lot of the points that I wanted to hit, and you've given us, I think, a lot of useful lessons. Is there anything here that, obviously, with having worked in the movement for decades, there are many, many things you could tell us, but is there anything else obvious that comes to mind that you wish everyone who was in organizing today would internalize?
Probably the one thing that I haven't talked about much is building a movement around who the workers are, not what they do. And, they may be a janitor at a building, but they are a member of a church. They are a part of a community. They are a parent. They are a homeowner. They are a taxpayer. And by expanding what the fight is about in that way, the stakeholders to the battle grow exponentially. And I think that we need that. Business can't win a fight where it's business against community. It's business versus the people, right? They lose that fight every single time. If Republicans followed what their stated aims were, they would lose that fight with Republicans. Now, it's not what they don't say what they mean, but the point is that, like I said before, on the janitor campaign or the security campaign that we did nationally, those were battles between the real estate industry and the Black and Latin communities, the communities of color, low-income communities in major urban settings. And the real estate industry could not defend itself further impoverishing inner cities. They could defend themselves paying low wages to workers because they would pencil it out on a budget sheet. And so I think that whether it's Starbucks or Amazon, what they've done with the United for Respect work and in the Walmart campaigns, it's always about finding the set of stakeholders that makes you as big as you can possibly be so that you are wielding the most power you possibly can.
I'd like to close here just by reading a short excerpt from a piece that was co-authored by your colleague Stephen Lerner in the New Labour Forum, because it's a little bit inspiring and encouraging. It closes, "We believe the window of opportunity for which we have long awaited is here," talking about after many times where we thought the labor movement was going to be revitalized and it wasn't. They say it's here. We say this with some trepidation because we've lived through other moments of optimism, but this feels different. Current material conditions, the collapse of neoliberalism, the crisis of climate change, racial injustice, and extraordinary economic inequality make the need for change obvious to many. At the same time, focused struggle over the last 40 years to revitalize the labor movement has taught us important lessons and sharpened the tools we need to win. It is up to us to seize this moment, to imagine and win the world we want to create. I think that's lovely. I think you have given us a number of those tools we need to win today in conversation, so we thank you Jono Shaffer, for joining us on Current Affairs.
My pleasure.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.